Crystal chandeliers bathed the grand ballroom of Blackthorn Manor in golden light as the final note of an impossible piano concerto faded into silence. Hundreds of the country's most powerful figures rose to applaud, while Maestro Adrian Falk smiled and said, "Perhaps fewer than 20 women alive could perform that piece flawlessly." The room buzzed with admiration until Mafia boss Cassian Voss lifted his wineglass with a faint, amused smile. "If any woman here can play that concerto from beginning to end without a single mistake," he said, his calm voice silencing every conversation in the hall, "I'll marry her." Laughter rippled through the ballroom. No billionaire's wife moved. No celebrated pianist dared approach the grand piano. Near the edge of the room, a curvy maid named Elena Marlowe quietly set down the silver tray she had been carrying. Ignoring every mocking glance, she walked toward the empty piano. The laughter grew louder, until her fingers rested on the keys. And for the first time that night, Cassian Voss slowly lowered his glass and forgot to take the next sip. The morning of the Blackthorn Charity Gala began long before sunrise. While the city's elite were still asleep behind silk curtains and marble walls, the service staff of Blackthorn Manor had already been working for hours. Among them was Elena Marlowe. At 28, Elena didn't resemble the glamorous women who would soon arrive in designer gowns worth more than most families earned in a year. Her figure was soft and curvy, her black uniform simple and neatly pressed, and her dark hair tied into a modest bun. She rarely spoke unless someone asked her a direct question. She had learned long ago that invisible people survived the longest. Today, every crystal glass had to sparkle without a fingerprint. Every silver tray had to shine like a mirror. Every chair had to stand at exactly the same angle around the ballroom. Elena moved quietly from table to table, polishing the final wine glasses with practiced care. She noticed the grand piano sitting beneath the enormous chandelier. It had been delivered the previous evening and surrounded by velvet ropes to prevent anyone from touching it before the concert. For a brief moment, her eyes lingered on its polished black surface. Then she smiled faintly to herself and returned to work. "Don't even think about it," another maid whispered with a grin. Elena blinked. "What?" "The piano. I wasn't thinking anything." The older maid laughed. "You always stop when you see one." Elena simply lowered her eyes. Perhaps she did. She had never realized anyone was paying attention. Hours later, luxury cars began arriving one after another through the wrought iron gates. Billionaires, government officials, movie stars, international business leaders, world-renowned musicians. Blackthorn Manor slowly transformed into a stage where wealth itself seemed to compete for attention. The housekeepers lined the entrance in perfect formation. Their job was simple: smile, open doors, collect coats, remain unnoticed. Most guests walked past them as though they were part of the furniture. Some didn't even make eye contact. Others looked directly at the staff, only to criticize something. The flowers should have been white roses. "My champagne isn't cold enough. Why is the lighting so dim?" Elena answered every complaint with the same calm voice. "I'm very sorry, ma'am. I'll take care of it immediately." She never argued. Not because she lacked pride, because experience had taught her that pride didn't pay rent. Late that afternoon, a tall woman draped in emerald silk stopped in front of Elena. Her diamond necklace shimmered under the lights. This was Vivian Ashcroft, one of the city's most influential socialites and a generous donor to the gala. Vivian looked Elena up and down without trying to hide her judgment. "My goodness," she said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "Do they hire housemaids based on kindness now instead of appearance?" Several women around her chuckled. Another added, "With that figure, she should stay in the kitchen instead of serving guests." More laughter followed. Elena felt heat rising in her cheeks. She could have walked away. Instead, She bowed her head politely. "I apologize if I've caused any inconvenience." Vivian smiled with satisfaction. "Oh, relax. It was only a joke." The women continued toward the ballroom, still laughing among themselves. An older butler, who had witnessed everything, quietly approached Elena. "You handled that well." She forced a small smile. "I'm used to it." The butler looked at her for a long moment, before saying softly, "No one should ever get used to being treated that way." His words stayed with her, not because they changed anything, but because they reminded her that someone had noticed. As evening settled over the estate, musicians began tuning their instruments, while photographers gathered outside the entrance. The annual charity gala was about to begin. Every year, the event raised millions for children's hospitals. Every year, it also became the city's most prestigious social gathering. And every year, one man remained the center of attention: Cassian Voss. People feared him. People respected him. Some even admired him. Yet very few claimed to know him. When his black limousine finally stopped before the mansion, every conversation outside seemed to pause. Cassian stepped out, wearing a perfectly tailored black tuxedo. His expression remained unreadable. He greeted donors with effortless courtesy, thanked volunteers, shook hands with politicians, and acknowledged famous guests by name. Nothing about him suggested the ruthless reputation whispered throughout the city. As he entered the ballroom, his sharp eyes briefly swept across the staff, lined along the wall. For less than a second, his gaze met Elena's. She immediately lowered her head. He continued walking without slowing his pace. To him, she was simply another member of the household staff, or so she believed. Moments later, Maestro Adrian Falk arrived to enthusiastic applause. The legendary pianist smiled warmly as he approached the magnificent grand piano, waiting beneath the chandelier. Guests eagerly found their seats. The conversations faded. The lights dimmed. Standing quietly near the back of the ballroom, with a silver tray resting against her arm, Elena watched the stage from a respectful distance. She had no idea that before the night ended, every person in that room would know her name. The ballroom fell into complete silence as Maestro Adrian Falk adjusted the piano bench and rested his hands lightly above the keys. Without another word, he began. The opening notes drifted through Blackthorn Manor like a whisper, before erupting into passages of breathtaking speed and precision. His fingers seemed to disappear across the keyboard, weaving together delicate melodies and violent bursts of emotion that left even experienced musicians holding their breath. For nearly 15 minutes, no one reached for a glass of wine. No one checked a phone. The impossible concerto demanded every ounce of attention in the room. When the final chord thundered beneath the crystal chandeliers, the audience exploded into applause. Some guests rose to their feet. Others simply stared at the piano in disbelief. Maestro Falk accepted the ovation with a gracious bow before raising one hand for silence. "I have performed this concerto in concert halls across the world," he said. "Every pianist respects it. Most avoid it." A ripple of quiet laughter spread through the audience. He smiled. "Not because the notes are impossible," he paused, "but because the heart behind them is." The room became still again. This piece demands flawless technique, extraordinary memory, and emotional honesty at the same time. I would say, he glanced around the ballroom, there are probably fewer than 20 women alive who could perform it from beginning to end without a serious mistake. A murmur swept across the guest. Several famous musicians nodded in agreement. Others exchanged doubtful smiles. Near the back of the ballroom, Elena lowered her eyes and continued collecting empty champagne glasses. The conversation had nothing to do with her, or so she believed. At the center table, Cassian Voss leaned comfortably into his chair, slowly swirling the deep red wine inside his crystal glass. One of the businessmen seated beside him laughed. "So, Maestro, Are you saying none of the ladies in this room could prove you wrong? More laughter followed. Cassian's lips curved into the faintest smile. He rarely spoke simply to entertain a crowd. Tonight, however, something about the challenge amused him. He raised his glass slightly. If any woman in this room can perform that concerto from beginning to end without a single mistake, his calm voice carried effortlessly across the ballroom. Every conversation stopped. Even the photographers lowered their cameras. Cassian waited just long enough for every eye to turn toward him. "I'll marry her." Silence. Then the ballroom erupted. Some guests burst into uncontrollable laughter. Several women applauded sarcastically. One senator nearly spilled his drink. Vivian Ashcroft covered her mouth with a jeweled fan. "Oh, that's the most expensive proposal I've ever heard." Another socialite laugh. "Someone should try. Becoming Mrs. Voss would certainly be worth the effort." A few younger women glanced toward the piano before quickly looking away. The joke was amusing. Actually attempting the concerto would be humiliating. Even the professional musicians avoided making eye contact with Maestro Falk. They understood the difficulty of the piece too well. Cassian simply smiled and took another sip of wine. He expected no volunteers. That was precisely why the promise cost him nothing. Meanwhile, Elena quietly carried her silver tray toward one of the serving tables. The laughter echoed through the hall. She tried to ignore it. Yet Maestro Falk's words lingered in her mind. The concerto. She knew it. Not from sheet music, not from lessons. Simply from memory. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the tray. No. She pushed the thought away. This was not her place. She was here to refill glasses, not perform before the most influential people in the country. As she reached the serving station, she noticed the old butler watching her with curious eyes. "You seem distracted," he said softly. "I'm fine. You've been looking at that piano all evening." Elena forced a smile. "I've always liked music. So have many people." He hesitated before adding, "But they don't look at an instrument the way you do." Before Elena could answer, another burst of laughter echoed from the ballroom. Someone shouted jokingly, "Come on! Surely one brave lady wants to marry the great Cassian Voss." More laughter followed. Cassian himself appeared almost embarrassed by how seriously the guests had embraced the joke. He shook his head slightly and reached again for his wine. Elena looked toward the grand piano. Its polished black surface reflected hundreds of glittering lights. For reasons she couldn't explain, she remembered something her father had once whispered years ago. A piano never cares who sits before it. It only answers the hands that understand it. She closed her eyes. Just for a second, then she slowly placed the silver tray onto the serving table. The soft metallic sound drew the attention of the nearby staff. Without saying a word, Elena untied the white apron around her waist and folded it neatly beside the tray. One maid stared at her. "Elena, what are you doing?" The old butler watched in silence. A faint expression of surprise crossed his face. Elena took one steady breath. Then she began walking. Not quickly, not dramatically, simply one calm step after another. Across the marble floor, between rows of billionaires, past politicians, celebrities, and world-famous musicians. Conversations faded as people realized a housemaid was approaching the piano. A few guests laughed again. Others frowned in confusion. Vivian Ashcroft whispered loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. This should be entertaining. Cassian finally noticed the young woman leaving the line of servants. His amused expression slowly disappeared. He watched her without blinking. Maestro Falk stepped aside from the piano, but said nothing. He simply observed her with growing curiosity. Elena stopped before the magnificent grand piano. For a heartbeat, the entire ballroom seemed to stop breathing with her. She gently pulled out the bench, sat down, lifted her hands, and rested her fingers on the keys. For one long, unbearable second, Elena did nothing. Her fingertips rested lightly on the ivory keys, while hundreds of curious eyes waited for the inevitable embarrassment. Someone chuckled. Another guest whispered, "She doesn't even know where to begin." Vivian Ashcroft folded her arms, already wearing the satisfied smile of someone expecting a spectacular failure. Cassian Voss remained silent. His wine glass rested untouched beside his chair. He wasn't smiling anymore. Then, Elena pressed the first key. A single note floated into the ballroom with astonishing clarity. The second followed, then the third. Within moments, the familiar opening of the impossible concerto unfolded so naturally that every professional musician in the room instinctively looked toward the stage. No one laughed now. Her movements were neither theatrical nor hesitant. They were calm, confident, almost intimate, as though she weren't performing for hundreds of strangers but greeting an old friend she hadn't seen in years. Maestro Adrian Falk's expression changed immediately. His polite curiosity vanished. He stepped closer to the piano without realizing it. Impossible. She wasn't searching for the notes. She already knew where every note lived. The first movement grew more demanding. Rapid arpeggios flowed effortlessly beneath Elena's fingers. The impossible leaps landed with astonishing precision. Her wrists remained relaxed. Her breathing never changed. Guests who knew nothing about classical music could still feel that something extraordinary was happening. The room itself seemed different. Even the servants had forgotten their duties. Champagne trays remained untouched. No one spoke. When Elena entered the second movement, the music softened. The brilliant display of technique gave way to quiet emotion. Some melodies sounded almost fragile, carrying a loneliness that reached every corner of the ballroom. An elderly woman in the front row slowly removed her glasses to wipe away unexpected tears. She wasn't crying because the performance was perfect. She was crying because it felt painfully honest. Maestro Falk's heartbeat quickened. He leaned toward the piano, studying every movement of Elena's hands. Then he noticed it, her phrasing. She wasn't interpreting the concerto the way modern conservatories taught it. She played certain passages with tiny hesitations that most teachers would consider mistakes. Yet those pauses transformed the music into something astonishingly human. Falk whispered to himself, "No." A violinist standing beside him frowned. "What is it?" The maestro never looked away from Elena. That interpretation, it disappeared decades ago. The violinist blinked. "What do you mean?" "It belonged to an old European tradition." He shook his head slowly. "No academy teaches it anymore. Almost no one alive even remembers it." Meanwhile, Cassian watched Elena instead of the keyboard. There was no fear in her face, no desire to impress, no pride. She wasn't trying to win applause. She looked like someone quietly telling a story that only the piano could understand. For the first time that evening, Cassian became genuinely curious. Who was this woman? How could a housemaid possess the composure of a concert artist? The final movement arrived. Its terrifying pace had defeated countless accomplished pianists over the years. Several musicians unconsciously leaned forward in anticipation. This was where she would fail. The tempo accelerated. Elena's fingers flew across the keyboard. The passages became increasingly relentless. Yet every note landed exactly where it belonged. Not rushed, not forced, simply certain. Vivian's confident smile slowly disappeared. One businessman stopped pretending to sip his champagne. Another quietly lowered the phone he had been using to record what he expected would become an embarrassing joke. No one wanted to interrupt the performance anymore. Near the end of the concerto came its most notorious sequence, a brutal cascade of octaves and crossing hands that had humbled generations of pianists. Maestro Falk held his breath. Elena closed her eyes, only for an instant. Then both hands moved, as though guided by memory, older than thought itself. The final pages of the concerto burst through the ballroom with breathtaking power. Every note rang clear. Every phrase carried purpose. Every silence seemed as meaningful as the music itself. And then, the final chord echoed beneath the crystal chandeliers. Silence followed. Not polite silence. Not uncertain silence. The kind of silence that only appears when people have witnessed something they cannot immediately explain. No one moved. Even the photographers forgot to press their shutters. Elena slowly opened her eyes. For the first time since sitting at the piano, she looked around the ballroom. Hundreds of strangers stared back at her, some in disbelief, some in admiration, some with expressions she couldn't understand. She quietly stood from the bench. For a brief moment, she looked exactly as she had an hour earlier. Not a prodigy, not a celebrity, simply a housemaid in a black uniform. Then Maestro Adrian Falk began to applaud. Once, twice, again. Soon he was standing. "So am I," he said, his voice carrying through the silent hall. One by one, the musicians rose to their feet, then the guests. Within seconds, the entire ballroom erupted into a standing ovation. The applause seemed endless. Elena lowered her head, overwhelmed. She had never imagined so many people would clap for her. Across the room, Cassian Voss remained seated for several more seconds. His eyes never left Elena. Finally, he stood as well. He applauded only once. His expression had settled into its usual calm, but something behind his eyes had changed. The amusement was gone. In its place was a question. When the applause finally began to fade, Cassian turned slightly toward the head of his security team, who had quietly stepped beside him. Without taking his eyes off Elena, he spoke in a low, controlled voice. "Find out everything about Elena Marlowe." The guard nodded. "Yes, sir." Cassian looked back at the young woman, surrounded by applause. Somewhere behind that simple black uniform, there was a story no one in the ballroom had ever imagined. The applause continued long after Elena stepped away from the piano. She wished it would stop. Not because she disliked the recognition, but because every pair of eyes in the ballroom suddenly seemed fixed on her. A few minutes earlier, she had been invisible. Now strangers were trying to shake her hand, journalists were asking for her name, and several guests whispered as she walked past. Elena quietly excused herself and slipped through a side corridor toward the service wing. She needed silence. She needed to remember who she was before the music changed everything. Back in the ballroom, Maestro Adrian Falk remained beside the piano, still unable to explain what he had witnessed. Cassian approached him. "You've performed on the greatest stages in the world," he said. "Have you ever heard anyone play that way?" Falk answered without hesitation. "No." Cassian raised an eyebrow. "Not even among the famous?" The maestro slowly shook his head. "I've heard pianists with greater speed. I've heard pianists with greater power, but I've never heard anyone tell that story the way she did." Cassian looked toward the empty doorway where Elena had disappeared. "What story?" Falk smiled faintly. "The story of someone who learned music before learning how to perform." That answer only deepened the mystery. Later that night, Cassian's head of security quietly entered his private study. "I found information about Elena Marlowe." Cassian motioned for him to continue. "She has no conservatory education, no music competitions, no concert history, no professional performances." Cassian frowned. "So where did she learn?" The guard opened a thin folder. Her father, Thomas Marlowe, repaired and tuned pianos for old theaters and churches. Cassian waited. "That's all? Almost?" The guard hesitated. People who worked with him remembered something unusual. Cassian remained silent. They said whenever he finished repairing a piano, he would test it, by playing short passages from famous concertos. His daughter always sat backstage, quietly listening. Cassian leaned forward. She never received lessons. No formal teacher, no academy, no scholarships. The guard turned another page. Neighbors remembered hearing music late at night. They assumed Thomas was practicing. But after he became ill, the music continued. Cassian slowly closed the folder. A picture began forming in his mind. A little girl, hidden behind theater curtains, listening, remembering, returning home to an old piano no one else wanted, playing the same melodies again, until they became part of her. The following afternoon, Cassian visited the servants' quarters without announcing himself. The entire household froze in surprise. Elena immediately stood. "Mr. Voss, you don't need to stop working," he said calmly. "I'm not here to inspect anyone." The other staff quietly stepped outside, sensing the conversation was meant to be private. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Cassian asked, "Why didn't you tell anyone you could play?" Elena lowered her eyes. "Because no one asked. After last night, many orchestras would hire you." She smiled sadly. "I wouldn't know how to live in their world." Cassian studied her face. There was never any chance. There were opportunities. She folded another clean tablecloth before continuing. "But opportunities still cost money. My father could repair concert pianos. He could never afford to buy one. He taught me to respect music. He couldn't afford to teach me professionally." Cassian noticed there was no bitterness in her voice, only gratitude. "What happened to him?" "He became sick. I left school. I worked wherever I could. Restaurants, hotels, cleaning companies. When Blackthorn Manor hired me, it paid enough to cover his treatment." She paused. It still wasn't enough. Cassian understood the rest without asking. "I'm sorry." She smiled gently. He always believed talent wasn't something you owned. It was something you protected. For the first time in years, Cassian found himself with no clever reply. Before leaving, he glanced toward the old storage room at the end of the hallway. What's in there? A discarded upright piano. It hasn't been tuned in years. Sometimes, she hesitated. "I play after everyone goes to sleep." That night, long after the gala had ended and the mansion was silent, Cassian found himself walking through the empty corridors. A faint melody drifted from the storage room. He stopped outside the half-open door. Inside, Elena sat before an old piano scarred by cracked wood and faded keys. Several notes buzzed badly. Others were badly out of tune. Yet she played as though she couldn't hear the imperfections. The music wasn't the impossible concerto. It was a simple lullaby. Soft, warm, almost childlike. Cassian remained outside the doorway. He realized something that surprised even himself. The magnificent concert in the ballroom had impressed him. This quiet melody moved him far more, because no audience was watching. No applause would follow. She played simply because music still lived inside her. Without making a sound, Cassian turned and walked away before she noticed him. The next morning, the old upright piano had disappeared. In its place stood a beautifully restored concert piano. There was no note, no signature, no explanation. Elena gently touched the polished wood, confused. The old butler smiled knowingly, but said nothing. Across the estate, Cassian watched from an upstairs window. For the first time in many years, the most feared man in the city found himself hoping someone would sit down and play. 3 weeks after the gala, Blackthorn Manor hosted another charity reception. This time, the guests came with a different purpose. Many hoped the mysterious housemaid who had stunned the city's elite would perform again. Elena had refused every interview, every television invitation, every offer from prestigious music academies. She still worked at Blackthorn Manor. She still wore the same black uniform, and every evening, after her duties were finished, she quietly practiced on the piano Cassian had anonymously restored for her. Only one thing had changed. She no longer felt invisible. As the reception began, a black luxury sedan rolled into the courtyard. The moment the driver opened the door, Elena felt the color drain from her face. She recognized the man immediately. Victor Hale. Years earlier, Victor had purchased the theater where her father repaired pianos. He closed it within weeks, dismissed nearly every employee, and sold the building to luxury developers. Without work, her father lost not only his income, but also the only place where music had filled his life. The financial collapse that followed eventually cost him his health. Victor, of course, remembered none of it. To him, it had been another profitable business decision. Inside the ballroom, Victor noticed Elena carrying a tray of champagne. He frowned for a moment before laughing. So, the little stage girl became a maid after all. Nearby guests fell silent. Victor stepped closer. "I remember your father. He wasted his life fixing instruments that belonged to people richer than he could ever become." His words struck harder than Elena expected. She lowered her eyes, struggling to remain composed. "My father loved his work." Victor shrugged. "Love doesn't pay bills." It certainly didn't save him. The ballroom grew painfully quiet. Several guests looked away, uncomfortable. Before Elena could answer, another voice broke the silence. "Enough." Cassian Voss crossed the room with measured steps. His expression remained calm, but the room seemed to grow colder around him. Victor forced a smile. "I didn't realize she was important to you." Cassian stopped beside Elena. Then, without hesitation, he gently took the champagne tray from her hands and placed it on a nearby table. Only then did he face Victor. "You judged her father by his bank account. You judged her by a servant's uniform." He glanced around the ballroom. "I judge people by what remains after applause fades." No one spoke. Cassian continued. "The wealth in this room bought paintings. It bought companies. It bought influence." He looked at Elena, but none of it could buy what she earned through patience, sacrifice, and quiet perseverance. Victor scoffed. "She's still only a maid." Cassian's answer came without the slightest hesitation. "No. She's the most remarkable person in this room." Silence settled over the guests. Even Vivian Ashcroft lowered her eyes, remembering the cruel joke she had made only weeks before. Cassian turned toward Elena. She looked confused, almost overwhelmed. He smiled for the first time since the evening of the gala. "I made a promise that night." Soft laughter spread through the room as people remembered. Cassian nodded. "At first, I meant it as a joke." He reached into his jacket and removed a small velvet box. "But I've learned something since then." He opened it. Inside rested a simple diamond ring. "I wasn't impressed because you played an impossible concerto. I was moved because you remained kind after the world gave you every reason not to be." His voice softened. "Elena Marlowe, I don't want to marry the woman who amazed an entire ballroom. I want to marry the woman who practiced alone when no one was listening." Tears filled Elena's eyes. For several seconds, she couldn't speak. Then she smiled through them. The same gentle smile she had worn while polishing glasses before the gala. Only this time, the entire ballroom stood waiting for her answer. She gave a small, trembling nod. "Yes." The applause that followed sounded very different from the applause after the concerto. That night, people weren't celebrating extraordinary talent. They were celebrating extraordinary character. A year later, the grand ballroom of Blackthorn Manor looked much the same. The crystal chandeliers still illuminated polished marble floors. The grand piano still stood beneath the soaring ceiling, where laughter had once echoed at the expense of a quiet housemaid. But everything else had changed. Every Saturday morning, the mansion opened its doors to children from struggling families. Some arrived wearing worn-out shoes. Others had never touched a piano before. Elena welcomed every one of them with the same gentle smile. "There are no auditions here," she would always say. "Only curiosity." She never asked whether they could afford lessons. She remembered too well what it felt like to stand outside a world that seemed reserved for someone else. As tiny hands explored the keys for the first time, music once again filled the ballroom. Not as a performance, not as a competition, but as hope. From the last row, Cassian Voss often watched in silence. He never interrupted the lessons. He simply listened, just as Elena had once listened from behind old theater curtains while her father tuned forgotten pianos. Sometimes, their eyes met across the room. No words were necessary. The promise that had begun as a careless joke had become the greatest truth of Cassian's life. And the woman once dismissed as only a maid had proved something far more valuable than extraordinary talent. She proved that kindness, perseverance, and quiet devotion can create a melody powerful enough to change not only a single life, but every heart willing to listen.